Welcome to the Michael Shermer Show. It's your host, Michael Shermer. This episode is brought to you by Wondrium, the former teaching company. Great Courses, now expanded to include documentary series and films, television shows, and tutorials and lessons on all kinds of topics, not just the great courses that I have consumed for decades. I love this place. I love that they support my show. I hope you appreciate their services by checking them out. Just go to wondrium.com, wondrium.com/Shermer, and you get a free trial and 20% off the annual subscription rate. So your subscription gets you access to all of their courses and the tutorials, documentary films and series, and so forth. Here's one I just noticed that popped up on my screens. Kind of one of the nice things. They alert you to the new courses. This one's called Reconsidering JFK. Take an exciting new look at JFK's presidency, enhanced by new documentaries, interviews, and information about this exciting period in American history. As you can see, I've listened to the first two episodes on JFK Reconsidered and 1956, Vice President Kennedy, with a question mark. No, but, that's the idea of given. I didn't even know that he was being considered for that. Lecture 3, JFK's pivotal choices to win the presidency. Unearthing JFK's public and private lives. Oh boy, he had some private lives going on there, as we know. Kennedy's new approach to the presidency. 1961, the election of the president, promising the moon. Well, that's the moon project, the Apollo project, and so forth. Before and during the Cuban Missile Crisis, huge, massive turning point in American, actually world history, averting World War III, that thanks to Kennedy and Khrushchev. And a lot of stuff we didn't know until the late 90s when a lot of the assassination materials were released. Also released were these kind of backroom deals that Kennedy made with Khrushchev to avert World War. Anyway, that's just an example of what a fabulous course you can find that just gets released all the time. Check it out. Go to wondrium.com/Shermer to get your free trial and 20% off your annual subscription rate, which gives you access to all these great courses. All right, thanks for listening. Thanks for the support, and here's the episode. My guest today is, let me make sure I say this correctly, it is Anastacia Marx de Salcedo. Is that correct?
Close. It's Anastacia Marx de Salcedo, but you almost got it.
Anastacia, right. Yeah, exactly. Were your parents fans of the Romanov family or what? Just kidding.
That would be Anastasia.
That's right. Different spelling. You are a food writer whose work has appeared in Salon, Slate, the Boston Globe, and Gourmet magazine, and on PBS and NPR blogs. She has worked as a public health consultant, news magazine publisher, and public policy researcher. She's the author of Combat Ready Kitchen, your previous book, and lives in Boston, Mass. The new book is Eat Like a Pig and Run Like a Horse. So if I'm understanding the thesis, if you do a lot of this, you can eat like that. And just look at that burger. Oh my God, double patty with bacon and cheese. Oh my God. I love your book.
That is great. And yes, that is the distilled version of the thesis.
Right. So I often like to start off with a little personal information about my guests, just to find out who they are. Your first chapter does that. So maybe give us a little bit of background, where you're from and where you're born and raised and went to school and how you got interested in this subject. But then go ahead and seg into all the stuff in your first chapter.
Okay, yeah. So let's see. I was born in New York, raised in Boston. Went to Columbia University. I have, as you said, Michael, I've kind of had a varied career. I started out doing work as a public policy researcher at Harvard. I then became a news magazine editor. So I should say that I have a very strong entrepreneurial streak on both sides of my family. 3 generations of entrepreneurs. So kind of working in a large institution is less appealing to me. And then I became after my stint in journalism, began to work doing public health, and have continued to do that. At the same time, I had a deep interest in food, and I started out as a food writer, just writing sort of any sorts of topics. Latin American food was a favorite. But I also became interested in industrial food. And so one of my very first pieces was for the online magazine Salon on Annie's mac and cheese, which I said that it really wasn't any better than Kraft's. And that created a huge online outpouring of indignation, which of course is very interesting when you're a writer. And so I sort of, that kind of like headed me off into sort of further pieces about food. I think I did one on breakfast cereal, looking at pizza. And eventually I ended up sort of getting deeper and deeper into the food science piece of it. So at one point I sort of was, and this is kind of the topic from my first book, I was working on putting together lunches for my kids, and I happened to notice that all of the foods in that I was using, the bread, the sandwich meat, the goldfish crackers, and so forth, they all sort of had these incredibly long shelf lives, and that led me into this exploration of why. Ended up there understanding that the U.S. military was very involved in funding and doing the research for extending shelf life for combat rations. So that kind of led me off into the science direction. And sort of in a parallel track, in my mid-20s, I had the first of what was to be several attacks where I lost feeling and strength on one side of my body. And that was at age 27. And, at 27, when that happens, it's pretty earth-shaking. And at the time, it was hard to diagnose. So I went in and I saw a neurologist, and the neurologist said, okay, well, there are 3 options. Could be an anomaly, could be a brain tumor, or it could be multiple sclerosis. So I had another attack a couple years later, and then at that point I got an MRI, which then was a sort of a new technology, and that diagnosis was confirmed. Again, at that time, they were just coming out with interferon-based treatments, but it was quite early on, and I did not want to opt for that because there's some fairly serious side effects because of when you do the weekly injections. At the time, it was sort of considered to be sort of like a flu-like response. So I sort of practiced this self-care regime, sort of following really, I think, what are probably the typical recommendations for good health. But one of the things that was really fundamental was exercising, and in particular running. And so after my first 2 very serious attacks, which were kind of like strokes, I had a number of smaller flare-ups that typically would be the use of one of my legs or the bottoms of my feet. But eventually, when I sort of became a daily runner, all of my flare-ups disappeared. So, for a long time, I sort of said, okay, this is super scary thing. I was sort of the, let's just sort of stick my neck in the sand and not think about this too much. And so I just practiced my self-care, tried not to think about, my multiple sclerosis too much. But eventually over time, when I did not have progression, I began to get more comfortable with sort of examining where that might come from. And that is really what led to this book.
Right. So the diagnosis was ultimately MS and not the other 2. I always find that interesting how unclear it is. There's a certain amount of subjectivity on the part of the medical practitioners to decide what's the proper diagnosis. There's all this talk of like IBM Watson, grinding through these algorithms, but I'm not sure they're there yet for, compared to physicians with extensive background in these things. So what were they looking for to decide it was MS and not the other 2? And you talk about that in that first chapter, all the different things you had to go through.
Right.
Because so it's really kind of a signal detection problem, right? Determining causality. How do we know it's not this or that? And you look for certain signals that come along the way, and it's like it's slightly more likely to be this than that.
Well, so when I was first diagnosed, MS was considered a clinical diagnosis, which is to say that you basically have several different attacks, and they all sort of affect you the same way, and so it would seem to be this underlying condition. Of course, again, while fairly in the first, say, 10 years of my diagnosis, the MRI became available and more common. And at that point, you can actually see, by doing brain scans, that there are lesions on people's brains. Now, that said, lesions are not unique to those with MS. So there is, there are, you can have, but they're typical patterns that there are, and except for MS, you would have multiple lesions both on the brain and on the spinal cord.
Right. So just tell us what it's like to be diagnosed at 27. You're in the peak of your sort of physical and psychological self, and just kind of getting started on your career and life, and bam, you get this diagnosis. What did that feel like?
That feels devastating. It is, if you're lucky, and I think I was fairly lucky to that point in time, you're you've gone through school, you're in that sort of exploratory decade when you're looking for your career, you're looking for a partner, and, you're kind of looking forward to sort of what might be, normal life and marriage and working your way through whatever your field is. And so at that point, being diagnosed with an incurable disease, and now there are a lot better treatments for it, but it's still, incurable. I sort of said to myself, oh my God, I might not have this as much time as I thought. And I'd better just sort of live to the max now. And so it really shifted my perspective on life, which has been, I think, a permanent change. Although I have, subsequently become accustomed to, my stable condition. But it's something that I'm very much aware of, that, I don't have my time might not be as long as I would like.
Yeah. Well, is that normal for MS, mid to late 20s when it kicks in?
It is. I think many diagnoses are in the mid late 20s. Men tend to have a slightly different course, which I'm not overly familiar with, but it can also be diagnosed later and seem to shift more rapidly into what is called progressive. There are various sort of classifications for MS. The first, and actually there's sort of a one subclassification, which is benign, which might be mine, which is when you don't have apparent progression. And then there's relapsing remitting, which you may have some impairments over time, and then there's a progressive, and then there's the fourth one, which is really quite where you have deterioration that's very, very rapid. They're not entirely sure, I think, that even all of these are the same disease, and I think that's kind of typical of modern medicine, is that sometimes you'll kind of group things because the outward symptoms appear to be the same, when in reality there may be underlying causes which are very distinct.
And what are those for MS? It's autoimmune or something like that?
Well, yeah. I mean, so with MS, it is an autoimmune. I would say that's it's shifted over time. It was initially thought of solely as an autoimmune disease, and now there seem to be possible metabolic elements to it. So, I'm sorry. Would you repeat the question again?
Oh no, I was just asking
The MS.
What's the cause?
Oh, the
of
causes,
it?
right? Okay,
Yeah.
yeah. So other than that, I don't think they're entirely sure. There may be a genetic element. This is kind of standard issue for medical conditions. There may be an environmental element. One thing that is recently been, and I should mention that MS occurs more frequently. At first, it was thought to be at higher latitudes and lower latitudes. Now there's sort of some debate about that, whether there's some overlap with, sanitation and sort of the level of infrastructure in the location that patients are in. But that is uncertain. But the one thing that is now becoming very clear is there's a relationship with Epstein-Barr virus. And again, that most people in the US have been infected and sort of successfully battled Epstein-Barr virus. They may or may not have been aware of it, but 100% of, or close to 100% of MS sufferers have had a episode where they have had Epstein-Barr. Oh,
interesting. Yeah. Okay, just to remind our listeners, your book is not about MS and how to treat it. It's about diet and exercise, and as a sidebar. But it's the same problem. How do we determine the relative effects of exercise versus diet? It's really hard to do that. In the same way, it's hard to make these medical diagnoses. Doctors are not omniscient, so they have to take these clues they have and try to string them together into a reasonable, testable hypothesis, and then run more tests. So you have some autoimmune, so latitude differences would be what? How much vitamin D you're getting from the sun? Something like that?
Well, that's actually a really interesting piece, and I don't want to jump ahead into some of the thoughts I have in the book. But yeah, initially, I think there's an interesting kind of theme, which is something I'm kind of working around in the book, which is this human desire to have a simple answer. And so
yes.
I think initially there was, okay, so if MS occurs more frequently at higher latitudes, well, of course, that's the sun, right? So then there's been sort of another layer. Well, okay, at this around the equator, you have more of the sort of tropical climates and different climates where you might have, and then so another theory is you might have more helminth or worm infections, and those are protective, and that's something that I talk about in the book. And then finally, something which I explore and I don't think has really been explored too much in humans is it's not the sun so much as the heat, and in the fact that around the equator you tend to have very hot areas, and in those that has an effect on the body, on metabolism, and on the stresses that the body has.
Right. So you're living in Boston now. You lived, according to your book, you lived in Quito, was it? Or in Ecuador. I've been through there many times on the way to. You have to go through there to get to the Galapagos. You have to spend at least one night in either Quito or Guayaquil and then fly out to the Galapagos. I think it's part of their tourism dollars thing. But it's great. It's a fun city to walk around. But yeah, what a radically different environment, being right there on the equator versus, well, where you are. Boston is pretty far north. Any subjective kind of feelings of living in these two different areas for how that affected your body and your MS?
Well, I will say that one of my 2 stroke-like attacks that I had at the beginning was in Quito. So that kind of, but they do say that it seems to be related to your childhood exposure, because I think when people who have MS travel to other geographic locations, there is generally not a change in the course of their disease. So that might not say much. And in Quito, as you probably know, is quite high. So while it is the sunlight amount is the same, almost the same year round, the temperature is not as hot and muggy as it is in the tropics, and it ranges throughout the day from about 50 to 85.
Yeah, so just talk about this out loud for a second. Maybe the way to think about it is there's a primary cause. Maybe it's genetic or autoimmune or something like this. But then there's maybe half a dozen mitigating conditions that lead it to go one path or a different path or a third path or whatever, which could be all these different things you're talking about, including diet and exercise, that either fuels it or attenuates it or changes the progress of it or whatever. So it's never going to be just one thing. Almost nothing in human life is caused by one thing. And so maybe it's, just a combination of these. And that's a hard problem for scientists to figure out. What's you have half a dozen different things going on. How do you figure out which is the relative cause?
Absolutely. And that it's interesting that you bring that up, because I think that issue is one of the reasons that, we have this tendency, as we said, towards this, we like a simple, easy solution. And one of the other things I think that is just so human is we want it to be external. We don't want it to be us. We want it to be, something that we can control. And this would kind of go to the issue, sort of, I think one of our deeper sort of embraces of the idea of food as being something that is causing our problems. And certainly with an illness, when you first get it, you're like, what did I do wrong? Is there that thing? What is the thing that's poisoning me? It's all sort of externalized. It's very hard to accept the reality that it may be multifactorial. It may be unavoidable. And it may be something that we just have to coexist with.
Yeah, there is another cultural thing where we look for the causes in the person's own actions. Well, he died of lung cancer. Oh, gosh. Did he smoke? Oh, he smoked. Well, that's his fault then. And I don't do that, right? Because it may not be that. It may just be a genetic mutation, because there is a gene associated with cigarette smoking where if you have it, you're more likely to get lung cancer. If you don't, you're less likely. Not that you won't. But it explains that wide variation where some people smoke 3 packs a day and they live to be 90, and others never smoke and eat great and drop dead at 30. So there's all these other factors. But I don't know. It seems like we lean toward that, like, well, I don't do that, and I'm not like that guy, so I'm going to be okay, and it's his fault.
Exactly. We want to make it something that we can control, and that we can say, oh, that's not going to happen to me. That's deep human nature.
Do you ever read the obits going, okay, what was the oh, I didn't do that. Okay, good. I'm not going to be like this guy.
I'm as guilty of it as everyone else, for sure. I mean, and yeah, it's something that you just kind of. But my basic feeling is, of course, I don't want to say I brought on my MS. But I do sort of feel like, I don't know if there's anything I could have done to avoid it.
Yeah. And again, looking for single causes, we also look for single solutions. It would be nice if I could just take this one pill every morning and the whole thing would just go away and I don't have to do anything else. But it's almost never like that, right? So when you talk about like 10 chapters on the different effects of exercise versus diet, exercise feels like this is going to be a bigger commitment. I'm going to have to do this every day for an hour or two and for the rest of my life. And I just would rather take the pill or eat an apple each morning or whatever the easier diet thing is.
Absolutely. I mean, I think exercise is a difficult sort of therapy to embrace because, first of all, to be able to do it right, you have to put in the time. And so there's no way around. There's no shortcuts around to it. And the other important thing is that the effects are so diverse and multitudinous that it is really impossible to replicate with anything else. But I think most people don't really. there's a very simplistic view of what exercise does. And I think probably what I most hear is calorie burning. It sort of just looked like on this, really the goal of exercise is just to make sure you don't get fat. When in fact it's health imparting in so many different ways.
Yeah. Yeah, in 1980, I got into bike racing, and cyclists are fanatics about their diet and their weight because you got to push weight up hills, and it's about 1% more effort for every 1 pound you are overweight, right? So there's just kind of a power output equation that they use. But really, it's hard to figure out what's the right diet. And so you try different things, but you have an N of 1. Right. So you have no idea if it's this or that. Maybe I got a better night's sleep and that's why I feel better today. And it's not the weird diet I was trying at the time. And, I kind of threw my hands up after trying all kinds of weird things. Like I went on this fast with cayenne pepper. It was like honey, water, cayenne pepper, and lemon or something. And I was puking my guts out after a long ride. It's like, I don't think that was a good idea. And, so other people I was riding with were trying different weird things. And I just finally gave up and just went on the seafood diet. If you see it, you eat it. And it didn't seem to matter. I mean, it's like that actually was better. And the guy I raced against in Race Across America, 1982, Lon Haldeman, he just ate everything. And he was ahead of me. I thought, I'm just going to eat whatever I feel like. If I feel like eating a steak, I'm going to have that. If I'm going to have a liquid diet, I'll have that. I'll just see how my body feels. So hard to tell. But of course, that's just a personal anecdote. What researchers want to know is not does it work for me, but does it work for everybody? Or, 67% of people that used this diet that had this percent of carbs, this percent of proteins, and so forth, it had this measurable effect on this size of an N that we tested on. That is really hard to do.
Mm-hmm. I think I'm really glad you shared that anecdote because it reminds me of what you asked me at the beginning, which was, your understanding of my title. And it means that if you run like a horse, yet you can eat like a pig. But it also has another meaning, which is you might have picked up on after reading the book, which is pigs are omnivores. They have very similar digestive systems to ours. They have very similar metabolisms to ours. And one of the things that we share with pigs is that we can eat almost anything and thrive. And I think that that's really important to keep in mind. I think many of the people who look at sort of diets from an overview perspective, they have not been able to find that one diet is has an advantage over another. I think that's kind of just points to this underlying biological fact that we're omnivores. We're designed to be able to thrive in a place where we're going to primarily be eating tubers and, maybe a couple of grubs, or maybe we're going to eat a lot of, have seal meat, pure seal meat, and we can thrive in both those circumstances. So my feeling is that biologically we're really designed to be very flexible. So this sort of are these arguments about what is going to be the best diet for a human being. There's probably multiple diets that we can do well on. But the bigger issue is that why are we focusing on diet for health?
Right. Yes, because the so-called kind of Neanderthal diet or the Paleolithic diet, people seem to think it's this one thing, and they read one article somewhere about Neanderthals eating meat. Well, what about the Maasai people or the people in Papua New Guinea versus the Inuits who are eating fat and blubber, and the Papua New Guineans are eating tubers and plants and so on. It's whatever's available, right? It's like and on average, there's not one that's better than the other. So let's talk about the kind of the history of the scientific attempt to understand diet and nutrition and where we went wrong. You talk about this in the book. I've had Gary Taubes on the podcast and Nina Teicholz. Gary's been on this since the early 90s. He wrote that famous New Yorker, I think it was, or was it New York Times magazine cover story, The Big Fat Lie, I think it was called. And this was the first to kind of challenge a government-approved food pyramid And he was considered to be this kind of nut job, like a fringe crazy journalist that's lost his mind. He doesn't know anything about science and so on. And it looks like he and Nina and you have been vindicated by the science. So how did we go wrong on studying diet?
Okay, well, before we go down that path, I just wanted to add a little PS to your examples here from around the world. Which you pointed out Neanderthal, Paleolithic, the Maasai, the Intuit, and one of the things that people, and this will kind of go to answering the question you just answered me too, which is they're focusing so much on diet that they're not thinking about the fact that these are incredibly active people. These are people who are, we're talking about Neanderthal and Paleolithic, they're wandering around, they're moving all day long. It's probably the same probably for the Maasai and the Intu. So the physical activity that could be the basis of this incredible health has been kind of ignored. So that brings us to the origins of why. So in my, I'm going to go way back to World War II. And, World War II had such a huge impact on the world because there was this massive shift in what we did, and, led by the needs to take care of the soldiers in by the millions around the world. And one of the things that happened during those years was that people began smoking a lot more. One of the reasons was that the tobacco industry actually provided free cigarettes for the rations. So new, soldiers who maybe hadn't smoked before started. Over the period of World War II and a little bit before, the number of people who smoked cigarettes in the United States doubled. Primarily men. So after World War II, there was a spike in heart disease, and people didn't understand why. And so there was a lot of research done, in both in the United States and in Britain. And in the United States, probably one of the lead researchers, and certainly in retrospect now the most famous, was Ancel Keys. And Ancel Keys began at that point. He had actually during World War II, he had done one thing. He had actually developed a combat ration, which was something called the K ration, and that is the precursor to our sort of modern sort of snacking ration, because he was like, we don't want to have soldiers to have to heat things up in the field. Let's just give them some snack items that they can put in their pocket. I think it was actually originally called the pocket ration. So he had like crackers and like a little sausage stick and stuff like that. And the other thing he did was this experiment on starvation with conscientious objectors, which is pretty famous, where this was as an alternative to serving. So in that experiment, he fed them, a really reduced amount of calories, and sort of documented the impact on their bodies. And so one of the impacts was that their cholesterol dropped tremendously. So after the war, Keys was like, okay, that's really interesting. People are having this problem with, heart disease and high cholesterol. I know about this because in the starvation experiment, their cholesterol dropped. So I'm going to start looking at the impact of diet on cardiovascular health. On the other side of the Atlantic, there was a Scottish epidemiologist by the name of Jeremy Morris, who was also looking at cardiovascular health, but he was interested in the physical activity impact. So both of these epidemiologists started studies. Keys had a very ambitious vision, and what he wanted to do was to try and compare the impact of different diets around the world, and if that had an effect on cardiovascular health. So during the 50s, he actually was doing the early studies, the pilot studies for this. And at that same time, Morris was actually starting to publish the results of his work. And what his work was, he looked at cardiovascular health for London bus workers, the double buses with the stairs, and he compared the drivers and the conductors. And the conductors were always going up and down the stairs to collect people's tickets. And he found that that the conductors, had better sort of like fat ratios and better markers in terms of cholesterol and blood pressure. So he said, "Aha, physical activity," and he began to publish his results. At the same time, Keyes was doing his pilot studies, and he was, because he wanted to do this sort of international work, he was looking for a variety of funding sources. And one thing you can't, for example, get the U.S. government to fund a project over in Italy and Finland and Japan, which is where he wanted to do some of these studies. So he would get that money from various sources. And one of the things that, for some reason, has not really been explored is that during the time that he was doing these pilot studies, he's sought out and then accepted money from the tobacco industry to do some of his work. And what the tobacco now, in retrospect, actually, there's been this sort of basically a document dump from all the documents that the tobacco industry had collected over the years to do sort of the public relations manipulation that they did to be able to kind of keep people smoking as long as they did. And that library, part of it is housed at, I think, your institution, which is right, UC San Francisco.
Well, I'm in Santa Barbara, but yeah, I think that's right. Yeah, that's the right. The doubt is our product, right? They knew for decades that cigarette smoking was horrible for health, and they kind of pioneered what climate deniers use, kind of a set of arguments. The jury is still out, and we don't know for sure, and we need more research.
Exactly. So I bring that up because I think I can clearly see what was going on, because I can look at all these documents, and it's possible that Keyes and his colleagues did not, although I do quote some letters back and forth in the book, which it seems that he's going into this pretty clear-eyed. He is he identifies the Tobacco Institute Research Council, which was their science organization, as a source of funding. And he says, look, these guys are looking for someone that can exonerate tobacco, and I think that we've got some stuff that could do that. Let's go after it. And on the tobacco industry side, they have some communications amongst themselves, like, hey, this is looking really good. It looks like we can exonerate tobacco as a cause of heart disease. So this work was done, and it was sort of compared the impact of smoking and diet in I think for the tobacco it was 3 different countries. It was Finland, Japan, and I want to say South Africa, but I may be wrong there. And then this it basically, as you said, there was sort of the merchant of doubt approach, where it said, there's no impact here. These rates are all over the map, so it looks like tobacco has no impact on cardiovascular health. And there were several articles published about this, and then it was presenting on it at conferences. But more importantly, it became sort of the framework for the 7-country study. So that never changed. And so going forward, and that was a study that was done over decades, and it just kind of continued to reproduce this pattern. So the finding that there's no relation between smoking and cardiovascular disease was then used by the tobacco industry endlessly. And they placed media pieces around it. And one of the things that I tried very hard to do, I'm fairly certain that they had something to do with arranging the first really big sort of breakout article for Keyes' theory that diet, and in particular fatty foods, cause high cholesterol in Time magazine. But I was unable to get that little tiny piece of, of a confirmation of a communication between Clarence, the head of the Tobacco Industry Research Council, and a Time executive. But I suspect that happened. And then in congressional hearings and in presentations. So it was just used endlessly and repeated. And up until, really until the point when tobacco finally gave up on defending the position that it had no effect on heart health, which was in the 90s.
I know, it's astonishing. Yeah. Well, there was that story about President Eisenhower had a heart attack. So, oh gosh, what's the cause of this? Because he's a skinny guy. And, he likes to eat a lot of meat. And people seem to forget he also smoked a couple packs of cigarettes a day, right? So
exactly. He smoked 4 packs of cigarettes a day. And then his doctor, which is Paul Wright, what his recommendation was that he needed to cut all fat out of his diet. So this distortion really became the foundation, I think, for our understanding of the relative importance of diet versus exercise, and it distorted the diet side. I should also add in that in the pilot studies and in the 7-country study, Keyes and his colleagues were trying to collect some data on physical activity, and they did. But at the time, it's a little bit more complicated because during that time, because many occupations were quite physically active, they tended to do it to sort of be like executive is a not active person versus a laborer and so forth. But it does turn out that, and one of the things that I kind of bring up with Keyes, sort of his right-hand man, who is Dr. Henry Blackburn, who I interviewed for the book. He's he was 96 when I interviewed him, and he has the whole history that he's been working on trying to preserve. But it turned out that 80% of the men in the 7-country studies were moderately to vigorously physically active. 60% were regular smokers, and then you have this overlay of diet. So I think in what I would say is that given that you have these 3 very important, I think these are probably the 3 most important factors for cardiovascular health. How do we weigh those things? They weren't really weighed in the 7-country studies because the other 2 were kind of pushed aside. The physical activity, in part perhaps because of a little bit of a competition with Morris, and saying, well, your theory of physical activity, that's not it. It's my theory of diet, which, as we know, happens in science, sort of like especially it's a very sparring kind of, who's going to win this round. It's sorry. So I
well, I was just going to say, so one of the elements of good science now is declaring where your grant money came from for the research you're conducting, because everybody knows the effects of that, right? You have that quote from Upton Sinclair, it's hard to get a man to accept an idea when his paycheck depends on him not understanding it. So, yeah, and one of my favorite chapters in Naomi Oreskes and Eric Conway's book, Merchants of Doubt, is when there was an investigation of home fires, which appeared to be triggered by people smoking, particularly in bed, or they'd fall asleep on the couch and couch would catch on fire, the bedding would catch on fire, the pajamas would catch on fire, and the tobacco companies made sure that it was clear. The problem is not the cigarettes or people smoking. The problem is that pajamas are flammable, couches are flammable, drapes are flammable. We need to soak the American household in chemicals that are anti-inflammatory. It's just astonishing. And how many, for decades, people were buying all this stuff that was just soaked in chemicals that can't catch on fire. How about you just don't smoke in bed? Or better still, don't smoke at all.
Right. Well, that's actually really interesting. It's germane, I think, to this whole discussion of exercise versus diet, because I've in a long and complicated sort of story about the involvement of the pharmaceutical industry, and it's not in this book, but I have done some work, and I have another book which was actually kind of that I wrote before this, and which will be published afterwards. But they have been working very hard since the early 90s to medicalize obesity, and the way they've done it is pretty much following the tobacco playbook. You know, they got together. There's, you know, let's see what's a big disease that we could, you know, develop some new drugs for. Well, you know, obesity is becoming a problem, and so they've been involved at many different stages, from the using BMI as a way to measure health, from lowering the BMI for overweight from 27 to 25, to having the American Medical Association declare obesity to be a disease, later to have it be declared a chronic disease, and I think they had an adipose-based chronic disease. And all the while, they've been working on developing new diet drugs, and many of those have failed, but now they're really coming to market. I should actually, one other little piece of that, being involved in getting, once you have obesity declared as a disease, you wanted to have government programs fund weight loss with pharmaceutical treatment, and they are really at that stage. So one of the things that I found really interesting was, and this is going along the same as the flame retardants, which is so there's recently an article in the New York Times bemoaning and decrying the fact that a woman had been turned down for an obesity drug, which I think is called Saxandra, by Novo Nordisk. And I looked at that and I said, wow, they've finally gotten to that place where, instead of, you know, thinking about health, this woman was, you know, doctor had diagnosed her with obesity, and now the problem was she wasn't able to get the drugs, and that to me seems very parallel to that sort of solution, where we're now looking to treat obesity by taking a lot of drugs rather than looking at our underlying health.
Yeah, well, there's so much money to be made there. And maybe this is a good time to ask you about cholesterol and statins. I'm very conflicted about this. I ask everybody that deals with this on the podcast, you know, should I take a statin or not? And the reason I do, or I have, or sometimes I do, and all my doctors tell me I should, is because there's a family history. My father died of a heart attack at 61. His brother died of a heart attack at 61. His father died of a heart attack at 61. So the moment I tell my docs this, they go, oh my God, you're taking a statin. Because I was right, like at 200, which used to be okay, but then they lowered it from 220 to 200 overall cholesterol, and it was slightly high on the bad cholesterol, and the good cholesterol was okay. And the triglycerides were okay, but not as good. Okay, so, you know, so I started taking a 10 milligram and then a 20 milligram statin, and then I was cramping when I was on a long ride cycling. So, okay, I'm not going to take this anymore. I don't like to take anything, but, you know, okay, so... But pretty much every doctor I've ever talked to, it's just like, it just comes out like it's an automated response. You take a statin. I take a statin. Every doctor I've talked to says, oh, I take a statin just in case, you know, even though I don't need it. It's like, wow, okay. You know, and then when I look into the science of it, it's like, yes, okay, maybe the effects are there. again, they have these statistical arguments, like 100,000 people take the statin and there's X number of fewer heart attacks over the next 40 years or something like that. And I really can't tell if this has anything to do with me personally. It's just kind of a statistical, demographic, epidemiological type argument. What are your thoughts on cholesterol and statins and heart health?
The first thing I wanted to know about your relatives, if they were smokers and if they were physically active.
Yes. My dad smoked OPs, as he called them, other people's cigarettes. So you could say, I don't smoke.
Okay.
And then you borrow somebody's cigarette. And he was an alcoholic. And no, he didn't exercise. So yeah, to me, that seems completely different from me. But because physicians have in their formulaic appraisals or diagnoses is, kind of family history. Because there's got to be a genetic component, surely, to longevity and cardiovascular stuff. Yes. So, but it seems like it could be overridden. I just don't know. So sometimes I take it, sometimes I don't. I just go through different stages.
Yeah. Well, the other thing I would say though is that, first of all, so if for somebody who doesn't exercise, it's probably helpful if but and I know you're a fairly serious athlete, so if you're doing vigorous aerobic exercise, let's say 3 to 4 times a week, then I'm going to guess that your veins and arteries are a lot, smoother. And I mean, one of the issues is that of sort of like this little bit of debris that breaks off and so forth. So that I'm going to guess the condition of your veins and arteries is fairly healthy. I would not going to recommend one way or the other, but it seems to me that you would be in a better spot than your relatives who were smokers and were not physically active.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, for me, 3 to 4 days a week would be an off week. That would be a light week. I pretty much work out every day if I can.
Yeah. Okay. So I do too, and I don't, as you know, I don't take anything. I'm super healthy. I know I do have, heart disease in my family. I don't worry about it at all. I'm really quite confident that is all you need to do from a cardiovascular perspective. And once you get if you're feeling, that if you're working out 5 days, 6 days, 7 days a week, then I think that would be highly, protective for you.
Isn't statins like the most prescribed drug of all the pharmaceutical drugs? It's up there in the top.
I don't know, but I know they're and I remember when they lowered the threshold, and that to me seemed sort of right. That again, that was sort of the same process as has been for BMI, where and the other thing that the important piece with the BMI was sort of a redefining it from is obese rather than overweight. So those things have kind of like created this whole additional population, which could then be deemed, as requiring pharmaceutical intervention.
Yeah. Yeah, the BMI thing always bothered me. I was always like at 23 or something like that. It's like, woo, you're getting close to that 25. Because it used to be 27, then they lowered it to 25, where you're obese. They have to draw the line somewhere, I guess. And even when I was super fit and bike racing and lean, I was always hovering up there, and the doctors would, oh, you better watch it. It's like, look at me. Take my shirt off. Look at me. Do I look like I'm fat? And I have kind of a big upper body that I got from my dad. He was kind of husky. If I walk by the weight room, my arms get bigger. It's like I just can't help it. And a lot of my cycling friends are super skinny. They have no upper body. It's like sometimes I wish I had his upper body so I could climb better. But in fact, it's just the way you are, certain genetics. But that BMI seems like one of those I know they have data, but it seems like it's a little subjective in where to draw that line.
Mm-hmm. Well, I know at one point when I was looking at it that the military does not rely on BMI. They rely on circumference measurements. And the reason that they do that is because it's a better way to understand adiposity, where you're accumulating the fat. There are different, places in the body. And so one of the healthiest patterns of fat distribution, of course, is just like underneath the skin all over your body. So if you have like a big belly, that can be a sign, that you are, that you're not healthy, can be is sometimes a precursor to metabolic issues and cardiovascular issues. So, so where are you in that?
Well, my waist is like 33. I'm 5'7". Okay, 5'6 3/4", but I can round up a little bit. Yeah, and my I'm like 165, so I'm a little, but I'm 67 years old, I'm okay. I mean, I ride. I could do a 50-mile ride, no problem. Stay with the guys and so on. That's not the issue to me, though. Again, back to the kind of how the science works. The kind of gold standard of science is the randomized controlled trial, which you can't really do with diet, right? Because how do you force people? There's ethical questions, pragmatic questions. So you have to kind of look around for natural experiments. Well, the people in this area, they eat a Mediterranean diet, and the people in this area, they eat this other kind of diet. And you can try to make those comparisons. I guess the only controlled things you could have is in prisons, right, where you can force people, the prisoners, to eat one kind of diet or another. But then, if I recall, prisoners come in and out of prison, and the subjects are not all the same people, And if you ask people what they eat, they lie, misremember, exaggerate, confabulate. It's hard to get accurate data, self-report data on what they eat. Oh no, I've had no junk food, and then the spouse says, oh, actually, he went to McDonald's yesterday. Oh, okay. Right. So it's hard to get honest data on that sort of thing. So, a lot of what you're talking about in the book, with animal studies, I found really interesting. Like, how far do mice or rats or rodents run in a day if they're just out wherever in the wild, and it's miles. And how far do they run in these lab cages? Nothing. They don't go anywhere. They just sit there. And yet those are those are our subjects that they test these diets on.
They are, yeah. That's an excellent point. And so it was one thing I wanted to say, though, is that the issue becomes they're comparing different diets again, and as we talked about, I think there's a lot of flexibility in what is the optimal human diet, but it's possible that one diet is slightly better for most people, and one or another one is. But my larger point, and I hope, is that the relative importance of diet is a lot less than we think, and the relative importance of physical activity is a lot more. So, if you're looking not to lose weight, but to have good health, then you need to be paying a lot more attention and putting a lot more time into the physical activity side of it. So I think it's possible that one diet is slightly better than the other diet, but that all of that is sort of, to me, how many angels fit on the head of a pin, because there's other bigger and more important things to look at, which is what the impact is on our biological systems, which we are part of a kingdom that one of its characteristics is movement. We're animals. And what does it mean when we're not moving? How does that affect our system? So that's why, as you have now brought up, I'm trying to look at that through animals. And the reason why is that really by kind of widening my lens and looking at, how the lack of physical activity is affecting our fellow, our cats and dogs and horses and mice and so forth, we can kind of really see how it affects us. So going back to the mice, yeah, one of the things that I talk about in the book is laboratory animals. And I did a lot of work sort of understanding the whole history of that, and talked with the Jackson Laboratory, which kind of seems to all kind of go back to the same group of people, but was founded by C. Clarence Little, who was also happened to be the director of the Tobacco Institute Research Council at one point. Jackson Lab was founded back in the 1920s, really when genetics was first becoming sort of a field that offered some reasonable opportunities for scientists to be able to work on. And they created a model of mouse where they, through inbreeding, were really able to create sort of this creatures that were very, very similar genetically. And then they would be able to use those in these sorts of experiments which you're describing. But the one thing also in sort of coming from that era was the way that these animals are cared for. And for a laboratory mouse, they're kept in a very small, what is called sort of like a shoebox cage. And they just kind of, they're actually kept with a bunch of mates, and they kind of, maybe they wiggle around and they do a little burrowing if they're given some materials to burrow with, but they don't do anything all during the day. While I was talking to people about this, and I was talking to a researcher who had done her work with mice, and she just kind of mentioned to me, oh yeah, the mouse they like to run like 6 to 8 miles a day. Yeah, that's what they just like to do if they give them a running wheel. And I was, whoa, that's a lot of miles. And then I tracked down a scientist in Holland who had also, been aware of this, and said, but people would say, oh, well, the mice are running because they're stressed. They don't like being in cages, and they're just like dealing with their anxiety by going in the wheels, but not in nature. Mice don't do that. And she's like, well, maybe they would do that in nature. So she actually installed a running wheel in her, and she had a very wooded backyard in the rear of her yard. And then eventually wild mice appeared, and she had a camera that was, activated by movement. And eventually wild mice appeared and began to run in the wheel. And they would also run almost the same amount of distance as the ones who could only run in a wheel. And remember, so these are also moving around. And it turns out that mice are incredibly physically active all day long. In fact, so much so that our metabolisms change. And that's one of the things that I'm trying to emphasize in the book, is that if we're not every day putting our metabolisms through, let's say, the paces that they need to go through when we are doing a vigorous physical activity, one that really accelerates our heart, that's bad for our health. Mice their bodies don't change when they're exercising because they're exercising constantly. That's it. That's their base state. So yes, that's very interesting.
Yeah, I love that. Put a little Fitbit on a mouse and see if he gets his 10,000 steps a day. It's probably way more than that. And I'm sure a Neanderthal with a Fitbit would probably do way more than 10,000 steps a day. To me, the money shot in your book is this graph here. Let me see if I can put it up there for people watching to see. And then for people listening, I'll describe it. But basically on the top here, you have cardiovascular mortality hazard ratio, and the bottom is all-cause mortality hazard ratio. And the black versus gray is fit versus unfit. And across the board, although it's worse to be obese than it is to be overweight, pretty much barely distinguishable between overweight and normal weight. But the big difference is between being fit and unfit. And that's the same also with all-cause mortality. So that, it seems to me, is something of a control for one variable over another one. Not the perfect randomized controlled trial, but close to that. You're controlling one intervening variable and looking at the effects of the other. In this case, these two, exercise and I guess body fat or whatever. That to me seems like pretty clear evidence.
Yeah, that work was done by Glenn Gaisner, who's the I think at Arizona State University, and that is a meta study where he and a colleague looked at a lot of different studies of physical activity and weight loss, and and compared them and aggregated them. So and he came up with sort of a set of reasons why we should really be focusing on physical activity, and some of those were that it's something that really, once you can do a small amount of, or you do it regularly, and it will have a predictable and beneficial effect on anyone, whereas a weight loss won't. You can, there's really weight loss can act, and yo-yo dieting can actually be harmful. And so it was very clear from the work that he did that you could be healthy at any weight as long as you were exercising regularly, and as you mentioned, so there's very little variation in the normal weight, overweight, and obese categories as long as people were fit. So one of the things is too, and in that chapter I try and talk about, there are fewer people in the obese category who are fit. So that kind of masks that effect when you're just looking at BMI. It's a little bit closer in the overweight and the normal weight. And so one of the things that I talk about are Catherine Fliegel's work, who is this scientist who I think in 2004 had published a study of BMI and all-cause mortality, and found that underweight people are actually somewhat more prone to early mortality. And there was a huge outroar against this, because that was sort of during the time that we were kind of looking at obesity as being sort of the next smoking, and people were decrying it and feeling that is something. It was sort of the first intimations of the obesity epidemic. And rather than accepting her work, it was often attacked, and so she was really during probably the next decade ended up sort of working on defending her work. She in 2013, she and another colleague published a meta-analysis of the same issue, and they had the same finding that again, people who in normal weight and overweight were had pretty much the same level of risk, and there was higher for the obese and higher for the underweight. And again, she was attacked, I should also add, by a sort of a leading advocate of a diet-focused approach to health at the Harvard School of Public Health. So I think that was, and that I think is something that we should think about, which is why some of these people who are involved in diet and nutrition become so agitated and upset and sort of killing the messenger when it comes to this kind of information. I think that Glenn has also had some of this sort of response is disbelief and saying that it can't be true.
Mm-hmm. All right, let's talk about the different kinds of exercises and different kinds of diets. Clearly, exercise is probably more important than diet if your measure is just longevity and health and feeling good and so forth. But surely some foods are better than others, right? I mean, so the food pyramid is inverted. Meat, protein is okay. Animal fat's okay, as long as you're exercising, I guess. But is there some kind of limit on that? What have you encountered in terms of the ratio of, say, animal proteins and fats versus carbohydrates, and then what about sugars and carbs and those sorts of things we've been hearing about?
Well, I think the first thing is that you have to understand what the function of each of those macronutrients is in the body. And so carbohydrates and to a large degree lipids, fats are there for fuel. Proteins are there for building new cells, building and repair work. So you need to, of course, have a base level of all those things. Within the more fat, more carbohydrate, I'm agnostic. I don't see that. I'm going to guess that it's probably, like I said, there's probably different variations that are work perfectly fine, because again, we're omnivores and we can fit, and our metabolisms as well work with these two different substrates, fuels. They work with with sugars, and they work with fatty acids. So I don't see there being a huge need to make a determination between the exact level of fats and carbohydrates, as long as you're getting a sufficient amount of macronutrients, protein, vitamin, the micronutrients, which are the vitamins and minerals, you should be good. If you eat more calories than you burn, you're gonna gain weight. And I would not glug soda or fruit juice all day long. I don't think that's probably super healthy. And yes, I think and eat vegetables and in quantities, because those are great. And I think this actually is not just sort of me, but it was done, some work done a few years ago, I think it was called Interhealth, where the Interheart study, where it was a international study and looking at the different diets, and they really came to the conclusion, again, don't drink too much sugary drinks and eat your vegetables, and other than that, we really can't determine it.
Right. Well, we're recording this right after Novak Djokovic just won Wimbledon. He's famously a plant-based vegetarian. Well, I think he's actually vegan. And his opponent, Nick Kyrgios, I think is a meat eater. I don't know. I mean, these are just anecdotes. They don't really mean much. But on average, there's this kind of debate about whether it's better to just eat mostly a plant-based diet, or can you just eat whatever you want? What are your thoughts on those studies and that debate?
Well, it depends on your lens, because from a planetary perspective, maybe it's better to have a plant-based diet. From a health, you're going to get me down a complicated rabbit hole here. Because if we look at vegetarian and vegan foods, there are a lot of processed foods in there. So I know, for example, my kids are now into the oat milk thing and the almond milk, and as opposed to dairy. Well, I looked at it and I say, okay, this is a milk. It's a highly processed food. It's got a fair amount of sugar. I'm a little bit skeptical on that. So you have to be, a little more. I think it's not easy to just say vegan or vegetarian or plant-based without actually consider the types of foods in there. If you want to be a meat eater, I think bottom line is, it's just not as important as your physical activity. So I'm not here to advocate one diet over another. I'm just saying that what you should be paying attention to, what you need to be thinking about, or let's say putting your time into, is not, if you have a limited amount of time, which is pretty much the case for most of us, don't spend 2 hours thinking about dinner, making dinner. Maybe spend an hour doing that, and spend another hour walking or biking or doing something else.
Yeah. My friend John Mackey, the CEO of Whole Foods, who's been on the show, and he's hardcore vegan. He really lives it, and he's super healthy, but he works out a lot. He's kind of an ultra marathon hiker. He does like the Appalachians and the Pacific Trail. I don't know what but he goes for it. So he's healthy. But again, he does a lot of exercise. You got to keep both of those elements in mind. So in the exercise area, okay, I have another anecdote for you. When I got into bike racing, I lived in Brea, California, in Orange County, and I met this guy named Phil Granaccia. And he was quite a bit older than me, super fit. He was a criterium racer, just flat circle, just like 1 mile loop, and you do like 70 of those. And he was really good at this. Anyway, he used to tell a story about he was in the 1950s. He was Mr. California bodybuilder, just massive. And he did the pharmaceutical help too, like a lot of those guys did, maybe still do. Anyway, he said his story was he saw a pack of skinny cyclists going by when he's out one day, and he goes, I'm going to go out there and kick those guys' asses. I can do that. Look how skinny they are. So he hops on the bike, and off he goes, and he gets dropped in the first 5 minutes. He realizes, I'm not actually healthy at all, at least cardiovascular. I have no cardio at all, right? So then he switched and kind of developed his cardiovascular by cycling or doing stairs. He built this little stairwell. Before the stair climbers were popular in gyms, he made his own. And so on, and that he kind of emphasized that. So talk about the kind of relative difference between being a gym rat where you're in there pumping weights for hours at a time versus running, cycling, swimming, hiking, walking fast, whatever. And what's the research tell us on the relative benefits there?
Well, first of all, there are benefits to all types of exercises. So and they're all good components of a healthy exercise diet. But really what you want to have your main course be is aerobic exercise, because that has just such tremendous impacts at the cellular level. And that would, so you need that. What an aerobic exercise is that you have your heart rate is elevated, for the period of time that you're exercising. And what that does is it increases the rate at which your blood is circulating by up to 8 times. It increases the rate at which glucose enters your cells up to 50 times. It's just, it's this really, this incredible speeding up of your body's metabolic processes. And when that happens, your body kind of shifts over into, okay, I'm just gonna, take whatever's comes my way in terms of the fuel molecules to, okay, I need fatty acids now, because fatty acids, when you burn fatty acids, you get a lot more ADP, the sort of the coin of the energy coin for the cell. It in that process, it puts into place a bunch of little shifts that end up creating health at the cellular level, from things like, as I talked about in the book, you have lipid stores within that are right next to your mitochondria. So if you are and those are there so that you can just get started out, doing your physical activity. When you use those regularly, they're emptied out regularly. That creates health from a metabolic level. It avoids diabetes. You create strong, again, the mitochondria. The exercising at a intense level creates stronger mitochondrial networks and increases the amounts of the creation of different types of molecules which actually clear inflammation. So it's just it's something that is irreplaceable. You can't do that any other way. So you have that aerobic conditioning has to be the centerpiece of your physical activity, and then add in everything else. Great, strength, and they do have other benefits. I mean, increasing your muscle mass, will increase the amount of muscle cells that you have that increase your mitochondria. So all these things are good, but definitely that is the centerpiece.
Yeah. Last March, I ruptured my Achilles tendon playing tennis, so I had to get the surgery. It was pretty bad. So I was in a cast for a couple of weeks. I was feeling pretty pretty blue about the whole thing because I couldn't move at all. And then I thought, well, my upper body works, so I'll go to the gym and I'll hit the weights. And, I just have next to no upper body strength from being a cyclist, right? But I realized if I had light weights and just did like 50 reps rather than 10 reps, then that got my heart rate up. And I thought, okay. And then there was a rowing machine, and I just had my booted leg off to the side. And even though, most of the guys in there, and actually most of the women were lifting bigger weights than me, I realized, well, I don't really care about how much weight I'm pushing. I just want to just move the muscles, just get the heart rate up, right? So you could, if you love the gym, you could do that with high reps and lower weights.
Or the Stairmaster.
Or the Stairmaster. Yes, that's right. The Stairmaster.
Yeah, there are plenty of things you can do in the gym to get that to happen. So, yeah. And I actually, what you were reminding me of, and it's so important for everybody, whatever your ability level. And I talked to 2 people in the book who were paraplegic, who they are devotees of lifting weights, something called wheel running, which uses the arms to achieve that same sort of aerobic workout, and because it helps them to forestall any kind of like issues related to being immobile, from illnesses to occlusions, because they're not moving enough, and it makes them feel good. So it's something. Doing this kind of aerobic exercise is something that absolutely everybody needs to do. Yeah,
my college sweetheart was in a car accident and she broke her back and is a paraplegic for life. But she took up wheelchair tennis, and it's astonishing how what a whole community that is, and what a massive workout that is. It's amazing, and they even have it in Wimbledon now, wheelchair tennis, and there's a whole thing there. Yeah, so again, and I've seen wheelchair like marathon run. Well, the LA Marathon used to have the wheelchair guys would go off first, and they're just hammering, and these guys are super fit, and women too. So yeah, just again moving those big muscles, however you can do it, is the key. Okay, just a couple other quick questions on things that are important to me. Chocolate chip cookies, beer, and wine. Is that okay? As long as I'm working out.
Sure. Okay, so beer and wine.
I know. Well, I know it's not good, right? Because it's got sugar in it. It's like drinking orange juice. Yeah, it sounds like it could be okay, but I don't know.
I think. Calorie-wise, I think that the issue with beer and wine is not so much the calories as maybe the impacts of the alcohol. And I think, there seems to be, as is so often the case, there's, new research every day. But the most recent is sort of no alcohol whatsoever is best. But, and for a long time, there was the feeling that a drink a day was something that was actually contributed to cardiovascular health. So that's not something where I'm not ready to step in there.
And you don't drink at all, or do you?
No, I do drink. I'm just saying I do, but I'm aware of the research, and I think something recently came out that no level alcohol is good. It's hard. I can't give you any advice there. I would say drinking in moderation.
Yes, moderation, right. And coffee is okay now? That's back on the good side of the ledger?
Coffee is excellent. I mean, this is not my area, but again, I've seen the most recent, the news just seems to be getting better and better for coffee. So enjoy that.
Right. Well, Anastacia, you really look great. I mean, you're pretty open about your age in the book, so I'll say, you're 57, right? I mean, you look unbelievable.
Now.
58. You're 58. I'm about to turn 68. So
yeah.
To be 58 again. Hi, if that makes you feel any better. But you look great. So what is it you're doing? Give us just a quick rundown. What is your day-to-day life like?
So what I do is I run. I run 3 to 4 miles a day, and then I follow my own advice, which is I'm trying to sort of look for other ways to incorporate exercise into my life. So, I've actually just kind of picked up walking again. It's really kind of in the evening. I garden. And other times I've done dance, but since the pandemic, I've kind of eased off that because it's more fun to do it in person. Do some biking, but mostly just the running.
Zoom dancing's not as much fun.
I find. I mean, I think some people enjoy the Zoom.
And so before you go for your run, and is it better to exercise in the morning than the afternoon or evening? And do you eat before you work out?
I do, only because I think you could. So when you first start running, your body looks immediately to whatever is in the cell next to the mitochondria, and that's this little bit of fat and maybe a little bit of glucose. So once it gets through that, then it will shift into sort of more of a mix of fatty acid and glucose. I find that if I don't eat anything before I run, that I feel a little bit weak during that period before it shifts over. So I tend to eat like a handful of nuts and raisins, and then I sometimes have a second breakfast when I get back.
And what's the latest on intermittent fasting, where you, let's say, eat dinner at 6 or 7 at night, and then you don't eat again until, say, 11 or 12 the next day, so you have a nice 12 to 16 hour window in there of no food at all?
Yeah, well, that's an interesting thing. I think I'm starting to see some studies that are coming out that are saying that this may not be as healthy as people think, and to be a little careful about it. But I did talk to Mark Mattson, who's sort of the father of intermittent fasting. He was the one who did the research on rodents and found that when they fed us semi-starvation diet, that they lived longer. And in the book, he actually had also talked about being laid up, and he had actually been a runner and then had some issues with running, but had been playing pickleball, I guess, and then he had torn some muscles in his arm, and so he had been laid up, and he had noticed that despite the intermittent fasting, without the exercise, that his blood lipids and blood pressure it immediately began to worsen. So, and at the end of that chapter, I asked him, I said, what's better for you, intermittent fasting or endurance exercise? And he said exercise.
Interesting, right? Isn't the theory that if you're working out and you don't have anything in your belly or in your bloodstream, it turns to the fat in your cells, and that then is kind of a fat burning exercise?
That to me, so again, this is kind of based on the idea that the whole point of exercising is burning calories. And I don't think that's what the point of exercise is. So I think, yeah, okay, fine. When you first start exercising, like I said, your body looks to what's right immediately there in that skeletal muscle cell. And then it says, okay, I'm going to need some glucose, I'm going to need some fatty acid, get it on in here. But the real importance here is the cycling through and pulling those fat stores out, and then then maybe you replace them later on when you're having your beer or whatever's your energy bar. But the important thing is to keep those things in a dynamic state, rather than just sitting there and causing inflammation and getting to the point of possibly starting a disease process. So yeah, I
should mention one of the sponsor of this podcast is Wondrium, the former teaching company that has the great courses, and which I actually use all the time. I just took one on brain disorders. It was 24 lectures on Alzheimer's and Parkinson's and strokes and injuries and tumors and all that kind of stuff. And discouragingly, there's no cure for any of these but there is lots of stuff with diet and exercise. And the one common theme in every one of the lectures was you can really delay the effects of any of these brain disorders with exercise, cardiovascular exercise.
Yes.
And I thought, okay, good.
Yes.
I can at least work on that because I'm one of those baby boomers that's inching up to the wall, hoping that these Gen Xers and the millennials and the Gen Zers are going to figure this out before I hit the wall. But I don't know.
Well, the two things that I think are themes in the book, and maybe I didn't make them as explicit as I should have, but they're important in terms of how to understand this. And the first is the animals, and looking at the animals. That helps us understand that the physical activity is really part of our design and part of our well functioning. It's not, it's not optional that we are moving regularly, because if we don't do that, we are simply not going to be healthy, because we're meant to be moving regularly. And so I mean, one of the things, I looked at pretty much every animal that I looked at, from mice and rats to pigs to horses to bats, were tremendously physically active, and that has an important impact on their systems. And one of the ways that works and this is the second really important point of the book, is that people often talk about, or this comes from Hippocrates, let food be thy medicine. And it sounds good, but in fact, people don't take food pills to cure diseases, and they don't inject food. What really is medicine is physical activity, and the reason is that it unleashes these new processes and new molecules that are created to deal with the stress of that physical activity. So one of the stresses is heat stress, because when you're physically active, you create a lot of heat, and the whole metabolic process where you're burning fat at a high rate, all of a sudden, there's a lot of heat that needs to be dissipated. The body creates special molecules that are there to then dispel that heat, and that then reduces the amount of reactive oxygen species, which are the things that cause inflammation. Similarly, when you get very hot, you have something which is called a heat shock protein, which gets produced in high numbers to help you deal with the damaging effect of that heat on molecules. So the important thing is that physical activity creates this whole new system of molecules and processes that act on the same pathways that the pharmaceutical companies create drugs for. So food doesn't do that. Only physical activity does that. And so I think that's a really important distinction between physical activity and food.
Yeah, sure. Well, Anastacia, if I was diagnosed in my late 20s with MS and I saw you, I'd think, I'm going to do what she did, because, wow, she looks great. She's healthy, 58. At the end of your book, though, kind of the last page, really, you talk about some of the setbacks you've had. Although, knowing how long it takes to get a book published, I'm guessing you wrote this probably almost a year ago. How are you doing now? You said there were some issues with your hearing and others, and you went to a pretty dark place there, thinking, well, maybe this is it.
So let's say a little bit of a spoiler, because I kind of intended that to be a twist at the end there. But let's leave it with kind of where we started, which is that the medical diagnostic process is long, convoluted, and unsure. So I've done some diagnostic pieces to that, and I am stable. Okay. And if you want to know the rest, you have to read the book.
Have to read the book. Good, yes. We will put a link to the book in the show notes so people can get this. But it's really not about that. It's really about how all of us can benefit from this information that's now still new, astonishingly, after half a century of research.
I know we're at the end here, but I just wanted to put in a plug for this there's this incredible study being done at the National Institutes of Health. It's a multi-institutional study on the molecular transducers of physical activity, which is basically inventorying all these molecules I just talked about and which are, produced to communicate, to reduce oxidative stress, et cetera, that study is just in process, and I'm expecting some really interesting things to come out of it. I heard a little bit about some of the impacts in animals, and that perhaps will help shift the dialogue a little bit more. So we're thinking about why it's important to be physically active every day.
Well, you can include that in the paperback edition in a year from now, or the second edition a couple of years from now, after you finish that other book. All right, Anastacia, thank you so much for coming on the show. And thanks for talking to me, and thanks for this important work. Really, it's, just from a societal wise level and also a personal level. This is the kind of stuff people care about, their health, their personal health. And there's really a lot of gold in here for everybody. So thanks for writing the book.
Thank you. And don't worry, just keep biking.
That's right, keep biking. I won't. All right.